Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. I got a lot of positive feedback on my previous two videos on this topic, which was top 5 tips for archer players and top 5 tips for cavalry players. If you haven't checked that out, I'll leave a link to both those videos in the description below. You can go ahead and watch them whenever you feel like it. But here today, we're going to be doing the top 5 tips for infantry players in Age of Empires 2. Yeah, I didn't forget about you infantry players, even though the devs might have. Let's hop right in and check out the top 5 tips I've got for you guys today. Alright, so at number 5, I've got the best way to open up with infantry civs for the most part. Usually you have a bonus geared towards the early game, either towards your economy or towards some sort of infantry line. And the best way to make use of that and to get the initiative on the map is to open with either a drush or men-at-arms. A drush just stands for Dark Age Rush if you guys are new and don't understand the term. It's a Dark Age Rush which usually consists of 2 or 3 militia that you use to harass your opponent's villagers and maybe try to kill 1 or 2 of them. It's a really good way to get the first punch into a game, but there is a downside. The downside is that you stay in Dark Age a little bit longer. This means that if your opponent gets the feudal age and you don't do enough damage, sometimes they can retaliate pretty hard. Make sure if you're going for the drush that you wall up behind it at home and you stay safe from any incoming feudal pressure. And then once you get the feudal age, you can go for some archers or some scouts to follow it up, or even continue with a little bit of infantry followed up with some skirms. If you go for men-at-arms, that's also a really strong option. It just plays out a little bit differently. You make your militia on the way up to feudal age, and then once you get the feudal age with 3 or 4 militia, you get the men-at-arms technology, and then you look to put pressure with your initial scout and the 4 men-at-arms. This comes at a really good timing because you're going to hit your opponent when they just got their stable or their archery range up usually, and the infantry will be pretty much uncontested until they get out their own military units to deal with them. So you have a small window of 1 or 2 minutes where you have infantry on the field and your opponent doesn't really have anything if they're not also going for some infantry. That's why infantry rushes tend to be pretty strong. It gives you initiative and lets you put the pressure, and it kind of puts your opponent on the back foot from the start, which can be a really big advantage for you in certain cases. Alright, moving on to tip number 4 now. I'm going to go ahead and talk about a very important topic to understand if you're an infantry player, and that is don't rush into full infantry composition. Infantry in general in Age of Empires is more or less a situational unit or a situational unit class. The reason for this is that it's actually very easy to field infantry counters, and if you just rush into infantry, you're not going to have a lot of economy to sustain that much production, and infantry is really good when massed and not very good when you have only a few of them. The reason for this is if you think about like a cavalry unit, if you have just 2 or 3 cav, you have a lot of mobility, you can run around the map, you can pick your battles, but if you just have like a handful of infantry, you're pretty slow moving around the map. If you get caught, you can get cleared up, and you can't really snipe villagers under town centers with a few infantry because they can easily run away from you. That's why it's much better to have infantry in big masses, because then you can walk into bases and take out buildings, you can take big fights, and it's a little bit harder to counter them once they start getting massed as the game goes on. So my biggest advice, no matter what civilization you're playing as, even if you're playing as the Goths or as a Mesociv and you want to go for Eagles or Husk Girls, my best advice is to play the early game without full infantry, play with other units to start things off, like maybe go for some archers, maybe go for some scouts. Even if you open men-at-arms, follow it up with some archers and play crossbows in early castle, because you kind of lower your opponent's guard and you force them to react to what's on the field, which right now is either archers or cavalry. And then by the time they react to that, you develop your economy and then you make a switch into infantry in the middle-late game. This lets you get infantry when your opponent doesn't already have a counter to it, and you have some momentum backing your infantry switch. It also lets you have a pretty big economy when going for infantry, which lets you mass them up and go for those big armies rather than just a few infantry units that don't really accomplish a whole lot. So just in general, it's better to go for other options in the early game and then switch into infantry in the middle late game than to open infantry right away and then let your opponent go on an infantry counter from the start of the game, and then you're just kind of stuck in the mud. Alright, moving on to number 3 now, we're going to be talking about supporting infantry armies with other kinds of infantry and with other units in general to make it harder for our opponent to counter us. If we just have one type of infantry, for example a pikeman, or for example just a longsword kind of push, it's very easy for our opponent to counter us with maybe crossbowmen to counter even both of those units. And if we're going for a Husk Girl or Eagle Warrior, our opponent can easily go for longswords or knights to counter those units as well. So it's much better to mix infantry types to make it harder for our opponent to counter us. Think of it this way, if we got a Husk Girl push going and our opponent is on knights, well, knights beat Husk Girls, but if we mix in some pikemen as the Goths, all of a sudden pikeman and Husk Girl is a very hard composition for our opponent to deal with, and he's going to almost have to switch into longswords to be able to deal with that, which makes it very complicated for him. It's easier for us as the infantry player to mix in 2 types of infantry because we already have the blacksmith upgrades for the infantry line than it is for our opponent to get a brand new unit line going and get all the upgrades from them from scratch. So generally speaking, mixing 2 types of infantry is a really good way to make it harder for your opponent to deal with your push. I'm not saying you should always mix infantry with infantry though. Sometimes it's correct to use other supporting units. For example, if you're going with a pikeman push, you want to support that with siege and monks. Usually the siege will help you deal with archer units and also be able to break buildings. The pikeman deals with all cavalry, and the monk is a supporting unit that will heal and be able to convert some units as the fights go on. In general, with Age of Empires, it's a really good idea to mix different types of units and create a composition rather than just a one unit composition, because that makes it harder for your opponent to find the one counter unit. And this is especially true for infantry, so keep that in mind whenever leaning towards infantry in the middle late game. Alright, moving on to number 2, I'm going to go through a bunch of different types of infantry pushes that you can go for, and these are very popular and also very powerful, and they're incredibly difficult to deal with. So the first one is going to be the pike, siege, and monk push. I've already touched about this a little bit, but the whole idea is that the pikemen, you can mass them in feudal age with spears, get pikemen right away in castle age, and then land a forward siege workshop outside your opponent's base, go for mangonels and scorpions, maybe even a ram sometimes to kill their buildings on the outside, and you get to claim map control with a pretty cheap push, and it's hard for your opponent to deal with because they need to mix units to deal with it or go for their own siege to defend. It's actually quite tricky to defend this. The next one is all-in eagles with some monks and siege to support it. The same idea as the pike push, but this time with eagles you don't die to crossbows inherently, and your opponent is almost forced to go into something like knights or longswords, and this is where your monks and siege can support the eagles and take out the infantry or cavalry they go for. Monks are a very powerful unit when used offensively, so going for a ton of eagles, and then you already have a ton of villagers on gold, you can easily mix in monks, and that creates a very formidable push. Next up, we're going to have the Huskarl Longsword Pike Goth Flood. This is pretty popular, so not something very new for you guys to think about, but the whole idea is just to play off that earlier tip, which is mix the units as Goths. Don't only go Huskarl, don't only go Longswords, mix all of the units, or at least 2 of them. If you're going Huskarl, your opponent goes Knights, you mix in Pikes. If you're going Huskarl, your opponent goes Longswords, you can then go Longswords yourself, and because you're Goths, you get them for cheaper, and you're going to be in a good position. Mix those units when playing as the Goths. And then finally, we've got the Malian Longsword Pike Composition. Malians get extra pierce armor on their units, so going for longsword and pike is a really good way to have a unit that doesn't die to crossbows and skirms, and because you have pikemen mixed in, you don't die to cavalry very easily, and the longswords are used to push buildings and to push even town centers and take them out. This composition with longsword and pike also works with Bulgarians because you get the longsword upgrade for free, but the problem is you don't get that extra pierce armor, so you do die to crossbow. So only do that with Bulgarians or Japanese when your opponent is strictly on cav or infantry. Alright, before I show you guys number 1, I'm going to go through an honorable mention real quick, and this is that infantry with arson do a ton of damage to buildings, and you can easily take out even town centers with a bunch of like longswordsmen in late castle age onwards, so you don't need to get rams out to deal with your opponent's buildings. The infantry itself is very good at doing that, and in my opinion that's one of the biggest advantages of playing with infantry rather than playing with cavalry. Cavalry can kill buildings, but infantry does it a lot quicker, and it's harder for your opponent to react to. Also, infantry is a lot cheaper, so even if you take out a building and lose 5 or 10 units doing so, it's generally speaking going to be a pretty good trade if this is an important building you're taking out. Alright, moving on to number 1, and this is to know how to deal with infantry counters. Obviously, there's a lot of units that counter different types of infantry, like there's pikemen that die to certain things, longswordsmen die to certain things, Huskarls and eagles die to certain things, but there are some units that counter all infantry across the board, and I'm going to be talking about those units and how to deal with them in this particular tip. So the first thing that you're going to run into as an infantry player is siege. Scorpions and mangonels do really well against mass infantry because you move slowly and they can get some really nice shots off. The best thing to counter these is to go for redemption monks, and even if it's an imperial age, you can get block printing if your civilization has it, and it's going to be very easy to convert those siege weapons from a long range. That's the best way to deal with it if your civilization has access to this. Sometimes you don't have redemption and you don't have block printing, so it's not an option. In that case, I'd recommend going with your own siege. Mangonels or onagers will do the trick. Mangonels or onagers will trade well against other mangonels and onagers, and they destroy heavy scorpions, so you can just go for those. And then you can also mix in some cav to snipe them, so going for like light cav or hussar or even a few knights in castle age to snipe enemy siege can be a very good idea to then send in your infantry behind that. If you're up against mass monks, it's actually very easy to counter this. I would consider monks a soft counter to infantry because monks are good when you have only a few infantry, but as soon as you get to a big massive infantry, thinking like 30-40, even if you run into like an army of 10-15 monks, the opponent will get what, 10 conversions? You're going to be able to easily overrun those 10 conversions, kill them because you have like 30 or 40 units total, and then you can easily go ahead and clean up those monks. So against monks, you just want to wait to have a big mass and then simply overrun them. It's very easy to deal with that. And the next up, this is probably the hardest unit to counter, and this is basically any high damage range unit, hand cannoneer, arbalest, and heavy cav archer, for example. And the best thing to do against this is simply skirmishers. Skirmishers are a very affordable units, and most infantry civilizations get decent skirmishers skirmishers, and so I highly recommend you go with those to counter those kind of units. And I also recommend going for bombard cannons yourself if your civilization has access to them. Bombard cannons can deal with range units from a distance, and they also help you push buildings, so it's generally speaking a really good siege weapon to use when playing with infantry compositions. Alright guys, that's going to be it for my top 5 tips for infantry players. Hopefully you guys learned something new. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below. And if you feel like I missed something, also let me know in the comments below. I love healthy discussion around my videos. And that's going to be it for me, guys. Thank you for watching. Catch you guys in the next one. Peace.